Thanks so much. Just after I started work on this book, I went to see one of the greatest scholars of the 17th century. He'd written some of the finest pages about Salem, and I wanted some advice. When I left him that day, we were standing on the front porch of his house. He added another little piece of advice, pretty much as an afterthought. He said, I should probably warn you that when you write about witchcraft, really strange things happen to you. And I kind of forgot about that, like the comment disappeared in the air, and I went on to research the book. I write the book. I finished it more or less on schedule, kind of more or less, maybe sort of approximately on schedule. The publisher was really happy with it, and they were even happier when they learned that Publishers Weekly was going to do a profile of me this summer, with which they would run a full-bleed, full-page picture. And indeed they did, and here's what it looked like. So as you may notice, that Stacy Schiff is not I. Thanks to Twitter, it took me about 90 seconds to figure out that it's Amy Stewart, a novelist whom I've never met. She does have a book out this fall, though, which I'm thinking maybe I could cross-promote. And when I asked my publisher to send me this page so I could show people what strange things happen to you when you work on witchcraft, I also asked them to send me the table of contents. And here it is. I don't know if you can read it, but it essentially, I was rather surprised to learn that after 4 years in the archives, unearthing and deciphering and squinting at documents, corralling my imagination and hiring fact-checkers, I had written a novel. So strange things obviously do happen to you when you work on witchcraft. This is not a book of fiction. Instead, it's an attempt to grapple with exactly what happened in eastern Massachusetts in 1692, among the loopiest, really certifiably strangest moments in American history. Salem may qualify as the best known, least understood chapter in our past, partly because it seems so improbable and partly because it comes to us through Hawthorne and through Arthur Miller, who were in fact writing fiction. Here we are halfway between Plymouth Rock and Paul Revere, and suddenly everything just goes screechingly off the rails. I'll also make clear, in the course of 9 months, we go from one kind of story to a very different kind of story. It's a tragedy to which we go back regularly. Few corners of American history have been so often explored, and if you don't believe me, take a look at this. There's my local library's stack of 17th century American history. So you can imagine me eating my way from one end to the other. The other slide is my office shelf when I finished writing the book. You can see there at the very top there, those little Loeb Classical Library volumes. Those were leftovers from the Cleopatra years. And I've always wondered what Cicero thought about being wedged between the Puritans on both sides of him there. Salem is a little bit our national campfire tale. It's one of the rare moments in our history when the candles are knocked out and everyone seems to be groping around in the dark. That's where all good stories begin. In the dark, we imagine most vividly, and we believe most fervently. It's in the dark that we contemplate our mistakes and wrestle with our fears. In the dark, goes the Italian proverb, every cat is a leopard. And if you read the court papers of 17th century Essex County, which I spent a lot of time doing, you begin to notice that the New Englander lived very attentively, and very apprehensively in the dark. Women tend to stumble into their beds to find strange men sleeping there. Men trip home through the night to discover that familiar landmarks have moved, and that people get lost in their own backyards. Young men report that they're weak-kneed at the thought of riding home in the night to their families after sundown. And when the devil offers to accompany them, they accept his offer. I read every 17th century account of the New England murk, of the wolves howling in the distance and the lurking Native Americans, but it took me a really long time to figure out how dark truly could be. And in truth, it took me until this. This is Midtown Manhattan in 2012, in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. I was driving some friends home to their home downtown. We were uptown and we had electricity. And suddenly all those accounts of the New England wilderness made sense. I mean, you couldn't see anything. You could truly become disoriented in your own yard. And hence the line in chapter 1 of the book, the sky over New England was crow black, pitch black, Bible black, so black it could be difficult at night to keep to the path, so black that a line of trees might freely migrate to another location, or that you might find yourself pursued after nightfall by a rabid black hog, leaving you to crawl home bloody and disoriented on all fours. That's, by the way, from the court testimony. The basic facts of Salem are simple. In early 1692, over a particularly cold winter, A 9 and an 11-year-old girl begin to shudder and scream. They happen to have been the niece and daughter of the Salem village minister, Samuel Parris. Here he is. He would have been in his late 30s at the time. The cousins complained that something bit and choked them. Their bodies twisted. They would attempt to fly through the air and climb down wells. We have lots of descriptions of the afflicted girls, the bewitched girls' symptoms, but we obviously have no image. And here's the closest that we can really come. This is a 19th century French text on the phases of hysteria, on emotional trauma, and what its physical manifestations would have looked like. Remember that no one in the 17th century distinguished between an overtaxed nervous system and bewitchment. The first question anyone asked in the face of these kinds of symptoms was, and for some time would remain, am I bewitched? It was understood that any kind of prolonged fit had been sent by the devil. And indeed, within a matter of weeks, 2 other village girls began to exhibit the same symptoms. Everyone soon learned from their parents or from local authorities or from Reverend Parris that they were bewitched. And when that was the diagnosis, you can very well imagine what came next. The girls' symptoms seriously deteriorated. Soon enough, all 4 of them could reveal who bewitched them. We don't know why they named the names they did, but when you think about it for a second, to the question, who irritates, who annoys you, who unsettles you, who wishes you ill, every one of us has an answer. And so did the girls. The answer to that question in 1692 was clear. It turned out that there were not 1 but 3 witches flying around Salem. Warrants went out at the end of February for their arrests. The suspects came immediately before the authorities. Justice was very swift in the 17th century. And they were interrogated in the manner of the day, which meant that a local beggar woman, the first woman to be deposed, was asked by the justices when she had signed a contract with the devil, why she hurt the girls, what creatures she had dispatched to do so. Those questions came to her from very well-dressed, important men who owned significant businesses, who spoke with weight and authority. The contest was asymmetric, and I should say that this is a story that has something for everyone, and here you can see it begins to mutate because it begins as a kind of fairy tale. Once upon a time, a wicked witch casts a spell on a little girl, and it turns very quickly into a courtroom drama. Let me talk for just a few minutes about how witchcraft worked, what exactly a witch was. Not every 17th century New Englander was clear on the subject, but those who were exceedingly clear. To the early American, a witch existed as plainly as did heat or light. The early American witch, I should add, did not look like this, although there is a certain Wizard of Oz theme running through the Salem story, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And nor did a 17th century witch look like this. This is, by the way, the original, if you can believe it, the original Wicked Witch of the West from the book, The Wizard of Oz. I particularly like those, that flying pigtail and the spats, which are kind of unexpected for a witch. This is an early American Halloween witch. You can see that witches came very late to Halloween, and they didn't dress in basic black until after Margaret Hamilton and the 1939 Wizard of Oz. The witch, as a 17th century New Englander knew her, was someone who could perform unnatural feats because of the compact that she had signed with the devil. And from that pact, she drew her power to transform herself into cats, wolves, rabbits, and of course rabid black hogs. A witch could be a man or a woman, though more often she was female, and she maintained a menagerie of imps or familiars who could do her bidding. And those mascots could be turtles or weasels, cats, dogs, and toads were very prevalent. As you can see here, this is a 17th century witch who is feeding blood to her diabolical toads. This is a woman who has her diabolical familiars with her. You can see her black cat, of which there were a great number, and her demon familiar. And she illustrates a 1621 English witchcraft case, but this woman actually was acquitted at her trial. Here are some more diabolical familiars. You see that they range from the sort of standard issue barnyard pig to rather gargoyle-like fantastical creatures. Black cats were particular favorites. They seem to have been the archenemy of man from the very beginning, and they turn up regularly throughout the Salem testimony. They've enjoyed an association with the devil for a long time. Black dogs turn up a lot too, but historically English witches tended to prefer feline to canine form. This, by the way, is not a witch's familiar. This is our family cat, Moose, but I hope she's looking sort of vaguely demonic here. A witch signed her pact with the devil in blood, and she enchanted with effigies and ointments. She could be a muttering, contentious malcontent, or she or he could be simply strong or unaccountably smart. Both kinds of witches would turn up in 1692, as would wealthy merchants who were witches, sea captains who were witches, ministers and homeless 5-year-old girls who were witches. While her power was supernatural, the witch's crime was a religious one. In New England, her target was the soul rather than the body. And her connection to the convulsing Salem girls? According to the legal guide on many Salem desks, and which was about to land on Samuel Parris's desk, this is the volume by William Perkins, witchcraft, when it manifested, showed up as senseless trances, paralyzed limbs, convulsions, jaws clamped shut, frothing, gnashing, and violent shaking. In other words, the symptoms of the girls in the parsonage to a T. When Massachusetts established a legal code, the first capital crime was idolatry. The second was witchcraft. In the years since those laws had been codified, New England had indicted about 100 witches, a quarter of whom were men. Massachusetts, however, had hanged only 6. Beside the mystery of the girls' symptoms in Salem is a greater mystery. Why, in 1692, the hasty and the merciless prosecution? The charges were very familiar from earlier witchcraft cases. Casting spells on livestock was a fairly common one. In Salem, witches cast spells on cattle, on hay, on wagons, on muskets, on fireplaces. They sent dishes sailing through the air. Why, you might ask, are these women riding on a pig? This is from an early English witchcraft trial. These women had been accused of bewitching the pig. New England witches do not do a great deal of flying down chimneys, and they do a great deal of flying down chimneys and through apple trees, and ultimately they will fly to a satanic Sabbath. But I should say that traditionally the English witch did not fly. Continental witches, however, will fly, and that will give us a clue as to what's about to happen in Salem. And also, there were ghosts in 1692 who tend to flit in and out of the Salem courtroom. Most, but not all of them, are women who've come back to avenge themselves on abusive husbands. Those who do confess to witchcraft, and there are quite a number, will confess to having flown either on the devil's shoulders, or on poles, or on branches, or on sticks. No New England witch ever flies on a broom, I'm sorry to say. These are some English flyers. They seem to be recruiting the women on the ground here. This is an 18th century woodcut, however. As far as broomsticks go, this one is my favorite. Leave it to a French woman to be able to fly gracefully. This is a 15th century French set of witches. The accepted phenomenon on witchcraft basically went like this. Witches existed everywhere in the world, in every culture. And how is it possible that imagination, which is so varied and so unpredictable, could deliver the same idea across all cultures at all times? In other words, witchcraft was so preposterous, so improbable, it had to be true. You just couldn't make this stuff up. The first arrests in Salem surprised nobody. The suspects counted among the likeliest people to be voted off the island. And let me talk just for a minute about the next person accused, the fourth accused witch, for a few reasons. I think part of what fascinates us about 1692 is the seeming randomness of the accusations. What if the next knock landed on your door? In the case of Martha Corey, a very pious, stiff-spined farm woman in her 60s, we know what happened when that knock landed on her door. It was mid-afternoon on March 12th. She'd been named by a 12-year-old village girl, and it surprised everyone because she was a full church member and very devout. Because she was the church deacon and another man went to pay a call as a courtesy on her, and first they stopped off to see the little girl who had accused her. They asked if she could possibly be mistaken, and could she describe what Martha Corey had been wearing when she afflicted this girl. The child said she couldn't because the witch had blinded her that morning, but she would be back that evening to torture her some more. The men rode off. They found Martha Corey alone at her house. She welcomed them with a smile, but she also anticipated their question. "I know what you are come for," she said. "You are come to talk with me about being a witch." She was not a witch, and she couldn't stop people from gossiping. How do we know all this, by the way? This is the deposition against her, which the two men will write out after they visited her with that day. And they tell her that the girl has named her. The first question Martha Corey asks is, but does she tell you what clothes I have on? They were flabbergasted by that question because, of course, it was precisely what they had themselves asked, and they seemed to think that she had some supernatural knowledge. She assured them there was no cause for concern. She had nothing to do with witchcraft. As everyone knew, she was a very devout woman. She wasn't surprised, though, she said, if the devil had recruited the first 3 women. In her estimation, they were malicious, slothful people. An interesting thing about Salem is that even those who insist on their innocence, who believe in their innocence, think that the others are witches. Martha Corey that afternoon promised that she would open the eyes of the magistrates and the ministers so they might find the real witches, another comment that would backfire. Within the week, not only her 12-year-old accuser, but that girl's mother was also afflicted. A spectral Corey nearly tore the older woman to shreds, offering her a diabolical pact to sign. The warrant for Martha Corey's arrest went out immediately. This is it. She was accused of having committed sundry acts of witchcraft on a grown woman and on 4 youngsters, one of them Reverend Parris's 12-year-old niece. That note that you can see on the bottom in the different ink is the Salem constable's confirmation that he's arrested her and that she's in custody. And this document is dated March 21st, but because the Sabbath was the next day, she in fact couldn't be arrested until Monday, which left her time on Sunday to go to church along with her accusers. So before the pulpit that Sunday, you have 5 spellbound girls and women and 1 witch suspect, all of them in close proximity in a tiny building. This is a reconstruction of the village meeting house. It measured 34 by 28 feet. And you can see how dark it would have been inside. It wasn't always possible during the hearings that were held here to identify the suspects indoors. They often had to be taken out into the daylight. And when the minister began the service, the March service, he was interrupted by the afflicted girls in the pews. One pointed to the ceiling. She claimed she could see Martha Corey sitting not in her seat, but up in the beams nursing a diabolical canary. The next day, Martha Corey returned to the same room to defend herself. It was thronged with spectators. There was a palpable terror in the room. A visiting minister said that he could nearly make out the hammering hearts, the raised hairs on the backs of the neck. Martha Corey insisted on her innocence. One of the justices asked the question that gnawed on every mind: how had she known that she would be asked about her clothing? She tried to explain, but she was interrupted. Generally, 17th century courtrooms were not orderly places. The girls frantically pointed about the room. They could see, they said, the devil whispering in Martha Corey's ear. What did he say to you? Asked the justice. She had neither seen nor heard a thing. We must not believe all that these distracted children say, she replied, to which there were fresh agonies. Did she understand the meaning of distracted? Asked the justice, because by definition distraction was fleeting, and the girls were utterly consistent. Everyone, he reminded her, understood them to be bewitched. He urged her repeatedly to confess. She would not. One of the interesting things about Salem, I should point out, is that those who refuse to confess will hang, which is to say that the most principled, the most noble, the most steadfast people will end up faring the least well. Corey was pelted with questions, none of which she could answer. Instead, she posed a particularly plaintive query herself. Can an innocent person, she asked, be guilty? I don't know if you can see it, but this is the document of that hearing, and the first question here is, you are now in the hands of authority. Tell me now why you hurt these persons. And she actually asks if she can pray a request. She asks several times a request which is repeatedly denied. She insisted she had nothing to do with witchcraft, a statement that incensed the crowd. The girls began to yelp and to snap and to mock her replies. When she bit her lip with nervousness, teeth marks bloomed on the arms of the girls. If she clasped her hands together, the girls would begin to shudder. If she leaned forward, they would crumple over in agony. It seemed as if she were working witchcraft in the courtroom itself. By this time, 2 adult women are bewitched. In the course of the testimony, one of them, a 40-year-old woman, starts to howl in pain. And she says that it's Martha Corey who's attacking her, so the woman takes off her muff from her hands and throws it across the courtroom at Corey. It fails to hit her, so the woman then leans over and takes off a shoe and lobs her shoe at Martha Corey. It hits her squarely in the head. A pin that she had stuck in one of her victims also turns up that day in the hearing room. Pins will tend to turn up often in Salem. Here are some pins, by the way, from the Peabody Essex's collection. These were taken over the next weeks, or purportedly so, from the girls' hands and legs. One girl turns up with a pin puncturing her lips so she can't testify. Blood will trickle from another girl's mouth, and a red stain will appear across her bonnet in the courtroom. How do we know all of this? From two sources. A former village minister was on hand that day and published his account of the trials in April. This is the title page. You can imagine that the account of what was happening did nothing to alleviate the symptoms. And we have a lot of the paperwork, too, from this particular hearing. This is the deposition of one of Corey's accusers, a 17-year-old girl named Elizabeth Hubbard. It seemed that Martha Corey had urged her to sign a pact with the devil. She'd bitten and choked and pinched her, and the girl had the bruises to prove it. I believe in my heart, she testifies here, that Martha Corey is a dreadful witch. And as you can see, that some of this was added later. The court testimony is interesting because it's not infrequently edited or expanded on after the fact. This is in the hand of Reverend Paris. It's the local innkeeper's deposition against Martha Corey for having tortured the girls at the hearing. And you can see on that second and third line, he seems to have written out the account before he asked his neighbor to affix his name to it in the third line. Martha Corey that day went to jail. She would spend the next 6 months in chains and in prison, awaiting her trial. 6 days after the hearing, Paris will deliver this sermon in the meeting house. You can see it's titled, "Christ Knows How Many Devils There Are." And when I mentioned documentation, by the way, this is as good as it gets. Paris was a very meticulous, very diligent man, and this is the finest of 17th century penmanship. So I want you all to feel sorry for me. It's a finger-pointing sermon. After this, it's basically you're either with us or you are against us, and the community really divides between accusers and accused. People begin to remember things that they can't explain, often decades old things that they can't explain. Men begin to see their neighbors flying through the streets. The evening after the first hearing, two villagers will meet an unnatural beast on the ground, which dissolves in the moonlight. 2 or 3 women, they testify, materialize in its place and fly away. Shortly thereafter, behind locked doors, one of them sits up in bed when a great gleam and a big fat cat appears in his room. If this has happened to any of you recently, please let me know afterwards. All of this testimony is sworn on oath. It's all full of tall tales unless you happen to believe, as one woman reported, after having vowed to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, that she flew on a stick with her church deacon and 2 others to a satanic baptism, and that the previous Monday she carried her minister in spectral form through the air, along with her having previously conferred with her in her orchard with a satanic cat. Again and again, while working on the book, I kept thinking of Dumbledore in the 7th Harry Potter book. Of course it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it's not real? The first case came to trial in June, the first suspect hanged a week later, protesting her innocence to the end. Events moved quickly, arrests and afflictions multiplied. It was a plague that involved 100 witches, a number that grew to 307 and later to 500. And here's where the courtroom drama will mutate again, now into a horror story, not only for those who spent months roasting and then starving in airless, fetid prisons. Some suspects would die there, and others in chains would give birth there. By late July, the authorities begin to piece together a tale of a diabolical Sabbath, which witches flew to from as far away as Connecticut by various conveyances, all of them to land in Salem Village, and all of them part of a conspiracy not only to subvert the church, but to subvert the state. And according to Paris's daughter, by the way, Martha Corey also will attend that meeting. Again, you can reconstruct that meeting and these rituals from at least 50 court confessions, but we unfortunately have no image of the diabolical Sabbath. Here's the closest we can come. This is a 17th century German engraving of a witch's Sabbath. It's a more decadent production than a New England one, but certain themes are familiar. You'll remember that I said there'd been no flying in Massachusetts before 1692. Well, suddenly by the summer, everyone in Essex County seems to be aloft. Here's an earlier illustration from a Swedish witchcraft epidemic. And from the book, you'll see why Sweden is hugely important here. But notice that this woman is flying with her children. In Massachusetts in 1692, girls of 8 or 9 are accusing their mothers of coercing them into signing pacts with the devil. By late summer, the denunciations are flying in every direction. Daughters accuse mothers, brothers accuse sisters, and parishioners will accuse their ministers. In Andover, nearly 1 in 10 people was accused, including nearly every female member of the town's senior minister. Servants accused mistresses, although mistresses did not accuse servants. No one ever suffered from witchcraft without also being able to name a witch. Martha Corey went to her death on September 22nd, in what would be the last hanging. Before she hangs, she's visited and imprisoned by Reverend Paris, who will excommunicate her, and this is his account of the excommunication. He's irritated that the prisoner, who's a very religious woman, refuses to pray with him. In the 17th century, a prisoner also, by the way, paid for his or her jail charges for the blankets and the provisions. This is the jailer's accounting, and you can perhaps see that the third item here was for Martha Corey and her husband. By September, the colony had executed 14 women, 5 men, and 2 dogs for witchcraft. Somewhere between 140 and 180 had been accused. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the witch panic was over. The questions that Salem elicits are those of our nightmares. Can an innocent person, Martha Corey asked, be guilty? Might I be a witch and not know it? Another suspect asked. Could anyone, wondered a group of men late in the summer, think himself safe? A brash widow in her 50s came before the justices in April. She was not a witch. She could not even say what a witch was. She had the bad luck to be appearing before a fine logician. How can you know that you are not a witch and yet not know what a witch is? Asked the justice. So obviously what we have on our hands is not entirely a fairy tale or a courtroom drama or a horror story, but a thriller. Presumably that line of trees did not move from one side of the field to the other. Presumably there were no flights through the air or killer cats. There was no satanic celebration with a long banquet table in the Salem meadow. How then did these things happen? When you begin to pry the whole episode apart, you see that it makes uncanny and eminently modern sense. And no, I'm not going to tell you how that came to pass. The clues as to what drives Salem forward and what will result in an unprecedented 100% conviction rate, for the only witchcraft panic in our history, are woven a strand at a time into each chapter of the book. And it's meant to read like a thriller so that you get the idea of it only at the end. It's meant to unspool with the logic of a dream and the lucidity of the supernatural. The unlikeliest of heroes will emerge in the end. No, I'm not going to tell you who they were either, because that would make my publisher unhappy. We go back to Salem again and again for the same reason that it came to pass in the first place, the irksome lack of closure. We share the villagers' need for resolution. We go back to the trials for another reason too, though. As crack-ups go, this one counts among the more sensational in our history, to which so many later missteps would be compared. That is less on account of the scale than on account of the circumstances. The court in 1692 consisted of the best and the brightest. They lived in the finest homes in their respective communities. In 1692, it's the state, in the broad light of day, in the name of God, led by the ablest men in the colony, who sent innocents to their deaths. When friends and acquaintances came before them, those authorities doubted not the girls, but their own friends. This is a portrait of Chief Justice William Stoughton, who sat at the head of the witchcraft court. And I will give you a hint and tell you that he is not the hero of the story. He was nearly as starchy as he looks here. He's the most eminent New England legal authority at the time, and he will die at home 9 years after the trials without a word of regret or apology. He was the go-to person for all legal matters in 17th century Massachusetts. No one was better versed in legal code, which points up something else crucial about the panic. Erudition plays much more of a role in this story than does ignorance. Arguably, the Bay Colony qualifies as the best educated community in the history of the world until that time. The New England ministers, here Increase and Cotton Mather, the father and son to whom any number of civic authorities would appeal for guidance, had delved deeply into the literature. They had devoured libraries on the subject of witchcraft. If anything, they may have read too much. Today, of course, the trials endure as a sort of moral guardrail. This is where Salem mutates yet again to become a cautionary tale. They stop us when we overreact or overcorrect, when fear tends to overpower reason. They make the expert seem less expert. They remind us of the risk of thinking ourselves exceptional. Satan's appearance in Massachusetts seemed to the New England ministry like a badge of honor, further proof that New Englanders were the chosen people. That statement resonates. In troubled times, we naturally look for terrorists and traitors and secret agents because they hate us for our freedoms. I just want to add that Salem feels deeply and eerily familiar in an age of crowdsourced stories as well. An oral culture bears a remarkable similarity to an internet one. Both feed on indelible rumor. Neither has much use for truth. And the internet turns out to be a brilliant tool for sowing conspiracy theory. Things went viral in the 17th century too, and today we can be two places and two people at once as well, just as Martha Corey could simultaneously be at home minding her own business and at the parsonage pummeling and choking the children. At Salem's heart, there's a sort of fairy tale. There are these rippling sexual undercurrents and a lot of terror. It's really about what we see when we close our eyes, and about how those images can turn from one thing into another. It touches on what's unreal but by no means untrue. For all concerned, it's a story about everyone's agendas and everyone's secret agendas. The girls, the justices, the ministers. Everyone is trying to accomplish something here which is not what he states as his goal. They're what truly unsettle us, those agendas, just as they unsettled the 17th century New Englander who met with the goblin or the rabid pig. And out of reasons, the early American turned to witchcraft for an explanation. Out of reasons, you're of course supposed to turn to a book, which I hope you will enjoy. Thank you. I'm told you may have questions or comments or corrections for me.
Hi, my name's Laura. I had seen something once, PBS maybe, I can't remember where, talking about one of the theories for what happened in Salem being not just the hysteria of the girls, but also potentially a fungus that may have affected them mentally. Curious as to what your thoughts are on that.
I love that theory. There's a theory that the rye supply had been poisoned and that a fungus that caused hallucinations had grown. And it was a great and incredibly elegant theory, but which has been largely discredited for two or three reasons, the two foremost ones being that the girls are strangely, terribly afflicted at some times and perfectly normal at other times. And they tend to be the convenient times, like when they're asked to do housework or when they need to testify in court. And at other times, they seem to sleep like babies and be perfectly normal. So that doesn't entirely hold up. Also, if the grain supply had in some way been contaminated, certain members of the household, everyone would have been affected. In this case, you often have, like Paris's family, there are 3 unaffected children, and then there are 2 girls who are convulsing, one of whom is then sent away. But it doesn't affect the household universally. And also, apparently, it was the wrong season for such a fungus to have grown. But I love that theory, because it would have been so neat.
Thanks. I have a couple of questions, and you can actually refer me to the book if that's better. But first, what became of the girls who were the original accusers here? And second of all, historically, how much time did it pass before people properly came around on this and said, the witchcraft stuff is something in our imagination? How long was that before that was generally accepted in society?
They're 2 great questions. Let me start with the second one. What's really interesting about the end of the trials is that the accepted wisdom seems to be that they have indeed murdered innocents, but they also let guilty people go free. In other words, the belief in witchcraft survives 1692. The belief in a perfect prosecution does not. So the impatience here is with the way this has been prosecuted. It's not with the concept of witchcraft. And it will take years still for everyone to give up the belief in witchcraft. In 1693, Cotton Mather, bless his well-documented heart, is taking clinical notes on 2 more witchcraft cases, 2 more girls who in Boston claim to are basically experiencing the same symptoms. And he knows enough in 1693 to take those notes and to document the cases, but he says it's too volatile for him to publish these things now because everyone is still because Salem and Andover have been such a terrific wipeout and there's so much puddling guilt and shame over the issue. Nobody will talk about Salem for quite a while, but that belief that that belief in witchcraft persists. The girls themselves, it's a difficult book to write because, of course, no 17th century girl kept a diary. So we have the girls' voices, in the way, in how they converse with the devil, which is interestingly the place where they express themselves the best. When the devil will bargain with them and they'll speak back to the devil. Those accounts, of course, come to us from the male reporters in the courtroom. So we have nothing that's actually written in the girl's own hand except some testimony. We have no diaries. And we have very little about what happens to them after 1692. One of them apparently does continue to be in some way infirm, and it's very unspecific about what continues to torment her. The others go on to lead perfectly normal lives, and as I think I say in the last chapter, they go on to get married and have children, have families, not necessarily in that order. There's a strange amount of having children out of wedlock among the cohort of girls who had been afflicted in 1692. But most of them do seem to go on to lead normal lives. It's interesting because there had been a case of possession, of serious diabolical possession 20 years before Salem. And that girl, who was then a grown woman, would have been alive at the time of the trials, and the mother of a large family. And I always wondered, what did she think of what was happening? Because it could so easily have happened in her case years earlier, but the minister who had dealt with her affliction had really been very careful about containing the crisis in that case.
Can you talk a little bit about the research, how long it took and where you did it, and just what the process was like?
It took approximately 120 years. The research took 3 years completely. It took me about 3 years to research entirely and then a year and a half to write, during which I was still researching a little bit because, of course, once you start writing, you realize that you forgot to research something, or that you need to know more, or you just haven't got to the bottom of something, or you're just obsessive and you need to keep researching because it's better than writing, always. It breaks down about that way. The trial documents, these illegible beauties that you saw, are most of them at the Peabody Essex in Salem. And it's just astonishing because you're holding these papers that say so-and-so has been maliciously and feloniously and wickedly practicing witchcraft and is sentenced to hang. I mean, it sends chills down the spine. They have a great collection. Danvers has a terrific collection because they have the church record book, which, speaking to holes in the narrative, leapfrogs over the entire summer, as does a lot of the documentation. There are huge holes in the documentation. So great was the regret and the shame in the wake of Salem. The Massachusetts Historical Society has terrific stuff. So does, is it the New England Historic Genealogical or Genealogical Historic, whatever it's called, has great contextual stuff. And the American Antiquarian Society has a lot of the Mather material. And essentially what I filled in with were other 17th century diaries and the quarterly court records of the years preceding Salem, which are brilliant in giving you a sense of what New England life was like, what people's grudges and antipathies were, who was suing. Everyone, by the way, is suing everybody. This is the most litigious society you can imagine. And we're talking about litigation that can last decades and slights that reappear, years later. It gives you such a sense of what people's obsessions were, what the hot spots were, that trespass and drunkenness and fornication were the big sellers. There's a lot of witchcraft. There are a number of witchcraft accusations that go nowhere. It's fascinating in terms of giving you a flavor of New England life, which obviously came in handy when you're trying to explain the strains on either a young girl or on a civil authority in terms of adjudicating something like this.
Another question. So I think one of the most frustrating aspects of this story is this concept that there's no way to really prove your innocence. I was curious if it's a spoiler, you don't have to share, but if there's any record of someone actually rationalizing their way out of being accused outside of just being executed or confessing or pointing their finger at somebody else.
You put your finger, I think, on the thing that kept me awake most nights, which is that you're in a locked room and you can't get out. And once you're accused, basically, the answer is no. No one manages to get out of. Once accused, nobody manages to shirk the accusation. There are two ways out. One, and this was class plays a huge role in this story. The wealthy manage to escape. And most of them will escape to New York, which the relations between Massachusetts and New York at this point are very hostile, and New York very happily takes them in. And I kept thinking there were going to be great papers in New York saying, oh, those crazy Puritans, look what they're doing to each other. I never found them. But most of the fortunate people who escaped do go to New York. And the other way to get out of it was to confess. And that's, it does have some, without spoiling anything, it does have some bearing on why you have these unbelievably specific and colorful confessions. Because the more you confessed, the happier the justices were, the more useful you were to the prosecution, the better you fleshed out this this crazy story. And the confessors go back to prison, but no confessor hangs. So after a certain point, it does become clear that it's better to accuse than to be accused, and it's best to confess. So
They've told me in Old Sturbridge Village that there weren't forests for the most part. Everything had been clear cut to be used for buildings and heating and such. What was it like around this setting 150 or whatever years earlier? Was it foresty? Because all the public media presentations of I thought I saw something, hey, where did that person come from, are in a forested sort of environment, particularly when you have a low light, when you have shadowy light. It becomes very easy to imagine things. The demons in your mind basically become more tangible. Was it like that then?
that's also a great question. And here's where the court papers came in handy, and as did some of the captivity narratives, of which there are quite a few. Very unforested. There had been a remarkable, basically the Puritans arrived and cut down all the trees, is the long and short of it. Sound familiar, right? And today it's much greener and lusher in Essex County than it would have been then. And I kept having to remind myself of that with the help of the Danvers historian, Richard Trask, because I would say, well, you can't see from this household to the parsonage. And he would say, but you could have in 1692. These trees are 100 years old. And you can see in the court records how much obsession there is with timber, because, of course, without timber they can't build, and without wood they can't heat their homes. And without spoiling anything, the Paris household is under particular danger that winter because it's up to the parishioners to bring their minister firewood, and they don't like him and they're not bringing him wood. And it's a very cold winter, and he's shivering, and he's talking about this from the pulpit. And he's basically saying, how can you leave me without wood? I can't pray, and without pray I can't live, and you will dispatch me to the other world, and you'll have this on your consciences. It's a pretty contentious relationship. So yes, the wood is a huge flashpoint, as is the trespass on other people's yards to cut down wood that maybe isn't yours, or the carting away of other people's homes that you could use for the wood. And that was the second part of your question. Oh, you hear a lot about swamps, is what I was going to say. When you read the captivity narratives and when you read about spectral presences. At this moment in Gloucester, there are a lot of sightings of a spectral band of Frenchmen and Indians. And the local militia is terrified because they can hear these men, they see these men, but they can't find these men. And they're clearly just seeing things. But they always arise from the swamps. There's a lot of talk about the swampiness of the landscape, very little about the trees.
Thanks. This has been fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading your book. And I was just curious, do you have any thoughts yet on the topic of your next book, if you're willing to share?
I was hoping you all were going to bring that to me. I thought that was the transaction here. No, it's interesting. This material it does get under the skin in a way, and I have not entirely been able to emerge from it. I keep sort of seeing angles that I wish I could play with a little bit more, and I'm not sure if that's the fault of the material or of the tired and downtrodden author. But at the moment, no.
It's sounding like the possible explanation of sort of a combination of external stresses and internal just quarrelsomeness that seem to exist, is maybe a good candidate for explaining all this. But I'm wondering, and you've talked about some of the possible external stresses, I'm just wondering, have people been able to develop any personal motives in any of this? In other words, did some of the accusers have grudges or particular quarrels or property issues or anything like that against the people that they were accusing? I think in your book, you say that there was a lot of just, even people within their same family accusing each other, which would argue against that. But I'm sure people have done, probably you have done investigation about just the more obvious motives that might have existed. And what's the story on that?
Yeah, there was a wonderful book that some of you may know, which essentially argued that this had been the whole thing had been a property scam, and that if you accuse the right person, your estate would therefore flourish. And it had a wonderful set of maps which proved that the accusers were on one side of town and the accused on the other side of town, and how all of the properties adjoined. That too, unfortunately, doesn't really hold up. And it also doesn't explain why you have the intra-family accusations, or why someone like Rebecca Nurse, who's this extremely pious older woman who's actually never been in court, which was unusual in New England, gets accused. It's possible that people thought the family had too much land. It's possible that it's because all her children lived and most people lost children. It's possible that the family was simply too functional and other people were jealous. We do not know in so many cases why the fingers pointed where they pointed. The property thing, the only person who makes out well in terms of confiscating properties is the local sheriff, who's an extremely tireless figure and manages to be confiscating things the minute anyone is put in prison. But he seems to have done it in a somewhat under the radar way, and he doesn't share his proceeds with the authorities. So it doesn't really hold up in terms of some kind of conspiracy in that way. It is a number of forces, to my mind, it's a number of forces come together. And I guess the one that I would talk about without it being a spoiler alert is the political scene, which is that this is a colony that's completely, for 3 years, has been living without government, has a new government in place. The strains of the chaos of the last years are still very apparent, and the importance of establishing rule of law in the summer of 1692 is huge. So for these men, for the justices, all of whom have helped to topple a royal governor 3 years earlier and are in disfavor in London, to prove that they are competent and law-abiding and law-enforcing officials plays an enormous role here.
I'm just curious, like your research process, like the start to finish, if you could maybe touch on like how you kind of, like the first thing you do when you're starting to research a book, or like how that sort of evolves as you're further into researching the book and stuff.
Yeah, I'm really unscientific, which is to say if I'm working on a biography, which until now I had, or a living person, I usually started with interviews because I knew I had a limited amount of time often with a particular demographic. Obviously with a book like Cleopatra or this, that didn't apply. So I tend to go first to the primary materials, which is possibly the wrong thing to do because you're coming to them without the context. And then I circle back to them in the end. So I went immediately to the Peabody Essex and read through the witchcraft testimony. I didn't know what to make of some of it because I hadn't read everything else yet. I tend to confine myself to primary materials wherever possible because there's just such, I mean, you saw those shelves. You could be reading in those shelves for 15 years and never get to the end. So my feeling is to use the secondary materials as little as possible. Things like the Puritan sermons, any 17th century diary I could get my hands on. I don't think there's one that I missed. Anything that a 17th century New Englander would have known or read, and anything he wrote, I needed to read. And I don't do that in a particularly scientific way, partly because you don't really know what you're looking for. You haven't articulated your questions yet. And then that ultimately, of course, means that I end up going back to some of those things once or twice again. And, the court testimony is a perfect example of this. I read it once in the original. Most of it is published. 90% of it is published, at least. I went back to it again in its published form over and over again. And then often, not until 2 years later, did I actually notice that, in a particular person's testimony, she doesn't really give the authorities what they're looking for. She's just agreeing with them and collaborating with and agreeing with whatever they've said. She's not adding anything to their questions. It's the kind of thing that doesn't jump out at you until you've read it several times. So I guess the answer to your question is it's a kind of full immersion process for me, but it doesn't necessarily follow a linear line. And with people like Stoughton or the Mathers, I can't read everything no one can read everything the Mathers wrote, so I would read secondary sources. And I would confine myself, and that's actually a frustration with somebody like Cotton Mather, who writes, I think, 92 books in the 1690s alone. You have to really limit yourself in terms of what you're going to read. And those texts are really crucial because you begin to compare different accounts he gives or how he accounts for witchcraft at different moments and how his thinking evolves. So I tend to go back to the same things over and over and read them more closely rather than necessarily spreading myself more broadly. Thank you all.